welcome to Horse Buying 101. And we are Mountain Shadows Equine Revival. Just as a note, we are doing the recording, so if there's any problems with that, let me know. So Mountain Shadows Equine Revival, if we could change the slide. We are a 501c3 nonprofit horse rescue. Our headquarters is here in Laramie. We are Wyoming's most active horse rescue, though we do stay small on purpose. So you'll notice there aren't a lot of horses here. This is one of our 2 locations. We're kind of overwintering here so that we can use the indoor arena. Our main location doesn't have one, but in total right now we only have 9 horses, and generally we cap it at 13. And that's so that we can really focus on those horses and their training and their recovery. So we stay small on purpose. Our motto is rescue, revitalize, retrain, and rehome. So those are our 4 R's. Many rescues do most of these. What makes us unique and special in the rescue world is this training component. Excuse me. That is something I forgot to do. What we are convinced that a well-trained horse is much less likely to end up back in a bad position. So we really emphasize that. So where we get our horses are from livestock auctions, where there are known kill buyers that show up, and we'll talk more about that system later. And also owners who can no longer care for their horses, whether that's for medical reasons or financial reasons. We're locally based, so we're based here in Laramie, but we're active throughout this region. We serve all of Wyoming, northern Colorado. We've taken in horses from as far away as Oregon. We've adopted them out as far as Arkansas, and we have folks in New Jersey that are interested in coming out to meet our horses. So we're also internationally known and very active on social media, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. So please do follow our journey and our horses' journeys there. Let's see. Yep, next slide, please. Before we get to the slide, actually, a little bit about myself. So my name is Jana Urschel. I am the operations manager, and I started out as a volunteer in 2019, quickly joined the board. I was on the board for 3 years before becoming an operations manager. I volunteer my time as well, feeding and cleaning, and have recently learned how to train horses. So I also have started about 6 of our horses under saddle, and I'm still very much learning in that process, but enjoying it a great deal. I have 2 daughters who also both ride. We have 3 horses in our family. 2 of them came through the rescue, and then 1 we actually just picked up at a livestock auction very recently. That's a little about me. I'm going to go ahead and let my fellow team members here introduce themselves as well.
All right. Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm actually one of the founders of Mountain Shadows Equine Revival, and we started in 2019, and this was after I had been kind of watching all these horses go through livestock auctions, and there were all these just unhandled 2- and 3-year-olds, and I was like, man, if these horses could get just 6 months of training, all of a sudden people would want them. They would have homes to go to. If they ever ended up in an auction, they would be bought by private buyers instead of the kill buyers that typically ended up getting them. So when I got the opportunity, I've actually been on the board of this nonprofit since I was 18 and been volunteering since I was 16, so over 10 years. So when I got the opportunity to take over the nonprofit, move it out to Wyoming, and start it as a horse rescue, I kind of jumped on it. And so, yeah, we started out with a capacity of about 5 horses, and now we're where we are today. My background, I've been working with horses my whole life. I've been training horses for clients I started training my own horse at 14, started training client horses at 16, and just kind of grew from there. I've done everything from showing, managing equestrian barns, being a wrangler, and I've attended an equine training college and gotten my degree in equine science. And yeah, so that's that's a bit about me. At the rescue, I manage a training program, and they don't need much managing because they're pretty cool. They just kind of help out where they're needed. And I've started many of the horses that have come through the program, and also been a test dummy for a lot of them. But yeah, pass it over to Liz.
Should I I go ahead into my next slide or just start with intros for now?
Just do intros. So my name is Liz Luck. I have only been with Mountain Shadows since about September of last year. I actually met Jana a few years ago when she was looking for her daughters to get some horseback riding lessons, and so I taught them on my two chestnut mares, and that's kind of how I heard about Mountain Shadows initially, is because she and her family were looking to adopt their first horse, Hope, which they still have, which is awesome. But yeah, so since September, I've just kind of been helping out on the weekends and helping where I can. I've only worked with a handful of horses here on the ground, only a little bit of under saddle training. These girls have gotten some really good foundational training on the horses I have worked with so far, so that's just been a real treat. But yeah, my horse experience kind of starts. I'm from Maryland originally. I always loved horses, but never got the opportunity to do much with them growing up until I was about 13 or 14. I was cleaning stalls in exchange for horseback riding lessons from my sister's best friend. So that's kind of how I got into that. Her family trained thoroughbreds at the Pimlico racetrack in Baltimore, Maryland. So I kind of got into the horse racing world just a little bit, not a whole lot. But yeah, my love for horses grew from there. I fell in love with the Mountain West. My stepdad's family is actually all from Northwest Montana. So all very much in the mountainous areas and a lot of the Western riding. That's kind of what drew me out west. I actually got my bachelor's in equine science from Colorado State University. I did a few courses there, including, just overall equine science and equine health, as well as the colt starting class down there. So while I might not have quite as much consistent training background, it is something that I really enjoy to do. So I'm glad I can kind of help where I can here. Yeah, like I said, I've got two mares of my own, Angel and Izzy. Angel is not always an angel, but I did not pick her name, so I can't fault her for that. Izzy is truly my angel, but I love them both dearly. So yeah, that's kind of my introduction. Miss Brittany.
Hi, I have way less horseback than them. Oh my god, the light. Sorry. But yeah, I am the treasurer for Mountain Shadows Equine Revival, as I am an accounting major, and have some experience working for public firms in both auditing and taxation. And I do not own a horse, but I work with most of the horses that are companion horses or in some form of rehab at our horse rescue. And I've been in various different roles of Mountain Shadows while we've been growing over the years. Yes.
Alrighty. So where we're going to kind of start today is looking at some prerequisites for being Are You Prepared? I'm really glad we get to have this one-on-one time with you, because I can kind of actually work with you one-on-one to ask kind of what your setup is. But there are multiple different options for housing your horse. They include pasture, paddocks, stalls with runs. You get kind of a slew of ideas based on what your horse needs and what your personal property can allow. Pastures are really good for horses that prefer being turned out over large areas of land. It's really good to let them kind of stay in their natural horse behavior as much as they can. Horses do roam and graze about 20 hours, 16 to 20 hours out of the day. So if you're looking to try and keep them kind of more towards their natural behavior, pasture is a really good option. There are a few caveats to everything that we talk about today. So a few cons for pasture grazing. Some horses have insulin resistance or stuff like Cushing's, which you might be familiar with. So, you might be able to keep them in a smaller pasture with a muzzle, or that's where a paddock could come in handy, which I'll get to here in just a second. Also, depending on the size of your animals and where you are located, most states, I believe, only allow one animal unit per acre of land. Now, an animal unit essentially just means the amount of land that they can graze in a certain period of time, so you're not overgrazing. I believe cows are about 1.5 animal units, whereas goats, sheep, stuff like that, they might only be considered half an animal unit. So for horses, we aim to around one. Again, that might vary depending on where you are in the country and kind of what resources you have. The paddocks can be a really good option too. For example, if you do have that horse with Cushing's or an insulin resistance, if you need to keep them on a dry lot, you can really actually control their feeding and how much sugar intake they're getting.
It can also be nice too for horses in training. You know, if you have a hard to catch horse and you might need a little bit closer of a vicinity to be able to catch them and work with them, that's a really good resource as well. The only thing to keep in mind with these is dirt lots. If they are just an open dirt lot, it can get very muddy if you're in an area of the United States or the world where you get a lot of precipitation, as you will find out, sure, and I'm sure you already know, being from Florida, moisture and dirt don't really mix too well without being a sloppy mess. So that is one thing to consider, kind of the topography of your property as well. Make sure you don't have any major low points in your paddocks so they don't become mud pits. So next slide, please. So a couple types of fencing I'm going to talk about too. This is going to pertain more so to the pasture and paddocks. If you're from the East Coast, you're probably very familiar with the split rail wooden fences. Your 3-board fence, as you can kind of see in this picture below here, that's your pretty typical fencing material and look. The 4-board becomes way more expensive, and that's typically something you see in the higher end barns. It's more of, in my opinion anyway, it's more of a statement of status and saying, oh, this is a really nice facility, we can afford 4 boards, which, you know, it's not always the case, but it is something you typically see more in much larger operations. Wooden board fences can be really handy because the material is generally easy to access and easy to get your hands on. However, there are some downsides. Wood fence is higher maintenance in terms of it can be damaged over time with the elements. You do have to keep up on painting or sealing it to make sure that it doesn't rot over time, it doesn't splinter. And if a horse does run into it, one of the benefits of wood fencing is that typically it's fairly easy to replace just that portion of fence that's been broken. Some of the other fencing materials we're going to touch base on here in a second might be a little bit harder to replace, you know, individual sections of fence. So those are just some pros and cons. Barbed wire, strung wire, and electric wire are going to be a little bit more common out west, just because if you see these pastures that are hundreds and thousands of acres, wood fencing might not be the most economical or the most practical. Barbed wire is typically more seen for cattle pastures. However, it can be used for horses. The only downside using it for horses is that horses will spook and bolt in a way that cattle don't always behave. So, you know, it can be a safety hazard for horses if they spook and bolt. They might not see the wire, or they might not mind those boundaries and just go right through. And because it's barbed, it can pose a much higher risk for injury. Strung wire could be a good option, which could be paired with electric wire, especially if you have horses who might be pushy or test the fences or try and, you know, lean over the fence to get to some nice green grass on the other side. Those are a good option. You can easily tighten those over time. What happens with these strung fences is that you have to keep them as taut as you can, but over time they will get some slack in them, so you can easily tighten those back up. So that is a pro of those wire fences. The only thing I would recommend personally is if you have, I believe on the next slide it might have it, but you can put some tape on the top of your wire fencing to make it more visible, because another thing with wire is if you can't see it all that well, if the horse just sees the post, they might not notice that there's actual fencing to it and could bolt through it. So next slide, please. Even more fencing. So pipe fencing is also really popular out here in the West because of its accessibility and durability. There are pros and cons to everything. So we'll kind of go over some pros and cons of metal fencing. It is something typical, you can kind of see it here in the picture, but it is typically a lot more seen out west because a lot of railroads will recycle these old pipes, and they are typically a little less expensive because of that. They're usually repurposed. They are very sturdy and durable. However, as much as that is a pro, it can also be a con. Some horses, if you do have horses that are spooky, that will rush the fence, because there's not any give to it, it can also propose a risk of injury to horses. As a personal example, when I worked at the vet teaching hospital down in CSU, one of the horses got rushed by another more dominant horse in the pasture, and she got cornered, and it was muddy because it was a dirt lot and it hadn't been raining. And she slid into it and unfortunately smashed her face actually right into the fence. And luckily she was okay, but it took a lot of surgery, reconstructive surgery, to get her face back to where she could naturally drain and breathe. So again, sturdiness and durability is a pro, but in some circumstances it could be a con. So just something to keep in mind. PVC pipe is an option as well. However, here in the cold climates, you know, this might have been more appropriate in temperate climates like back down in Florida. They can splinter in the cold, and because they are I guess a little bit more expensive, and if they do splinter out here, it's probably not your best bet for in colder temperatures, because if it does split, then it's just expensive to replace. But it does give kind of a cleaner aesthetic to your farm as well. For gates, for any of your fences really, for gates, you want to keep in mind the direction they open to prevent other horses rushing the gate, getting you trapped in a corner, or just naturally how your pasture flows or how your fence flows too. You know, it's one thing if you have a gate open out, and it's great because the horses won't rush it, but if you're kind of on a downhill, it might swing open. So if you accidentally miss that gate, and you have a wide open gate while you're trying to handle your horse. So again, just some things to think about when you're designing your pastures or your paddocks. Shelter, one thing you will figure out if you haven't figured out already, Wyoming is extremely windy. That is the wind is our state flag, our state flower, our state food. It's wind, everything. So windbreaks and shelters are a huge consideration when you are planning your pastures out here in Wyoming, especially. Windbreaks, you want to kind of take into account which way the direction of the wind blows. Typically out of the west towards the east. Thank you. I'm glad you knew where I was going with that. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Another thing to keep in mind with these three-sided shelters is the horses you have in your pasture. So some horses, which we will talk about, even some of our rescue horses or personal horses, they might be pushier than others. So unfortunately, if you do have a more dominant horse in your pasture, they might keep all the other horses out. So that's why it might be a good idea to have multiple shelters in one pasture, depending on how large it is, or separating those horses as applicable. The windbreaks do come in handy for that that instance where maybe you don't have multiple shelters or you need to split up horses. If anything else, it gives them a break from the wind. But the three-sided are nice because it can get them out of any sort of weather elements as well. That doesn't mean they'll use it, but if it's there, then they have the option. More often than none, you see your horse standing out in the snow and they've got a perfectly good shelter about 10 feet away. But it is good to have. It's good to have it. So now we're going to talk about a couple different stall options. So typically stalls, as you know, the barn here is a good example. If we walk through, we can kind of talk about it more as well. But stalls are a really good option for a few different reasons, actually. They can be good for horses who need to quarantine, if you can keep them separated from other horses in the barn. Typically, you want at least 1 to 2 stalls in between those horses anyway, because they can always still contaminate the bars on the stalls if you do have a horse that needs quarantine. They also are good for any horses that have any sort of injuries. So a lot of horses who might have a leg injury, a sprained tendon. Jana can attest to this personally. She's had some struggles with her gelding lately with injuring one of his back legs. And so stall rest might be necessary to keep that horse a little bit more immobile. So it is good to have that option. If you don't have a barn with stalls, even if you can kind of just fence off a section of your paddock or pasture to keep them a little more contained, that's a good option as well. They're also needed for very specific needs, for example, breeding operations. A lot of the times when a mare is getting ready to foal, they'll kind of move her into the barn to make sure if the foal is born overnight, he's warm and he's sheltered. It's also pretty typical in breeding barns to see double wide stalls as well. Mares do like to move around a lot when they're in labor. I can't say I blame them. It's probably uncomfortable. So yeah, you would definitely see that in breeding operations as well. So in most cases, having at least one stall is a good idea just for emergency situations. So next slide. Now with that stall comes bedding. Not all wood material is created equal. You can see that is in all caps and 3 exclamation points. In some area of the country, there are different types of wood shavings and pellets that are available that can be toxic to horses. Black walnut and maple are 2 examples of those. Pine is typically what you see. It's also very available for your smaller critters as well. So typically it makes it easier just to make that into horse bedding as well. They are pretty absorbent and easy to clean, and depending on if you buy bags or in bulk, they are also easy to store and to actually put into your stalls. From firsthand experience, it was always nice having the bags that you can just haul into a stall, cut it open, and you're done. No mess in the aisleway to have to sweep up later, but they do come a little bit more expensive that way if you get them in bags. Straw is a good option for a couple reasons, but it also has its cons. It is inexpensive, so if you are on a budget, this could be a good bedding option for you. However, just like hay bales, they can get too compressed and contain too much moisture, which could lead to the growth of mold. They also become really good beds for critters, mice, squirrels, chipmunks, whatever. So that's something to keep in mind as well. One of the pros and cons, depending on which way you look at it, is that it's not super absorbent, meaning if your horse does urinate in the stall, it doesn't necessarily soak that up. So it is a little bit harder to clean. However, that could be something you need. Let's say if your horse is suffering from thrush or needs a dry environment, it kind of gets them up off that floor from that moisture. And then on the flip side of that, wood pellets, they are extremely absorbent, which can be good for cleaning. But however, if you're trapping all that moisture in the stall still, that could be a con for someone who's trying to get their horse over thrush, because then they're just standing in that moisture. So if you don't have a horse that's dealing with any sort of foot issues where you need to keep their feet dry, this is a really good option for cleaning purposes. And then same thing with wood chips as well. They are moderately absorbent, easy to store, and kind of similar to wood shavings and sawdust as well. So going back to a couple of our housing options, the stall and the run is a really good option if you have an in-between horse, or let's say you need to keep them confined, but they do still want to be able to stretch their legs a little bit. Sometimes if a horse is confined for too long, they can get what's called stocked up. They can get some swelling in their lower extremities. So this might be a good option for horses like that who can have moderate mobility. It's also really nice too because a lot of places back east anyway, they don't offer pasture boarding. But let's say, for me personally, I'm from Maryland, but I had my horses out here out west. I moved back east for a short period of time, and I realized I wanted my horse to be able to roam as much as she could. And unfortunately, pasture is not an option back east. There's not quite as much land, and it's a lot more expensive. So this was actually a really good option for her to be able to keep her stalled, which is what I only had access to. But then she was still able to kind of move her legs, get outside if she wanted some fresh air, to look around if she's feeling nervous or anything like that. Some barns, as you can kind of see in this photo as well, you might be able to close that door that opens the stall to the outside. So if you do have a horse where they do need stricter reduced mobility and stuff like that, that's a good option. And also if the weather gets nasty. Another thing you'll notice here in Wyoming is that when the snow falls, it falls sideways. And so a lot of that snow can end up in your stalls as well, which over time it will melt, it will soak up in your bedding, and it's also just kind of economical to be able to shut that door if you need it as well. Boarding options. So let's say if you're looking for a horse in the future and you don't have the ability to keep them at your own facility or in your own home, at your own home, I shouldn't say in your home. So there's a couple different options. So self-care and full care. Self-care, typically the owner is responsible for pretty much everything. That means cleaning the stall, feeding them, blanketing them, etc. However, some self-care places do offer minimal extra services, meaning they might be able to toss hay, but you're responsible for cleaning, you're responsible for blanketing, etc. So that's just a good thing to kind of ask the barn manager. One thing you have to keep in mind with this too is that it has to fit into your lifestyle as well. I know there's a lot of people who are busy, they travel for work, they might not be able to get out to the barn twice a day to feed or to clean, in which case self-care might not be for you, just because it does require at least twice a day commitment for feeding purposes. But it is a good option if you want to be able to get in touch with your horse, if you need to save some money, because they are typically less expensive than full care. But full care at a minimum, this typically includes feeding, cleaning, and watering. There are some barns that offer graining if you provide the grain. They offer blanketing, turnout, bringing them back into the barn. Sometimes they'll hold your horse for the farrier or for the vet if you're unable to get to the barn. So again, it kind of just depends on the facility you're looking at, but these are all a few different options that you might see between self-care and full care. And that brings me to what to ask your barn manager. So no matter if you're on a self-care or a full care facility, there are a few things you can ask. For instance, how often do your horses get fed? What type of hay do you provide? That's a really good question to ask. If you have your horse who is insulin resistant or has Cushing's, some of those higher sugar, higher starch diets might not be good for them. It could actually be very medically detrimental. So it's good to kind of get an idea of what type of hay they provide. Some barns will provide a grass alfalfa mixture, which might not be your best bet. So that's something you should ask for the sake of your horse's health. These next few questions kind of just go along with the type of facility that you're looking at to see what they offer. But you could ask, does the board fee include blanketing or is it extra? Daily medications, graining, holding for the farrier, etc. All the things I mentioned just a minute ago. These next few are also important too if you have any guests coming as well. So if you have any policies regarding the use of your facilities, some places will ask you to pay to bring your horse into another arena if you want to ride. Some places will require you to fill out a safety waiver, which is pretty typical. Some places will ask that you follow certain barn rules, meaning make sure you sweep up behind yourself, shut the lights off when you're done, etc. Some facilities don't necessarily outline those, but it's a typical rule of thumb to just make sure you're kind of picking up after yourself. And then these other questions as well are just kind of basic questions of things that we kind of talked about before, but this is a big one I like to mention. Do you give any updates when you notice something may be off with my horse? Chances are, if you're in a full care facility, it means you probably can't get out to the barn twice a day, every day. So it's really good to have that relationship with your barn manager or your barn owner to be able to tell you, like, hey, I noticed Angel's kind of limping today. You might want to come take a look at her. Where I keep my horses right now, the manager there is very good at giving me updates if something seems off, if they haven't been eating very well, or, if anything has changed. So that's a good thing to see what your relationship with that barn manager may be. What's the best way to get in contact with you? And then this is another one which you might not always see in barns out here, but I saw it was pretty prevalent back on the East Coast. But does the barn have a general barn vet or farrier I can use? So some barns do have a contracted farrier and or vet that you can use, and they specifically come to your barn on certain days, certain times to do it as a group. So that's something you can ask for as well. That's also a good resource if you're moving to a new area, which you have, and if you're not familiar with any local farriers or vets quite yet either. So boarding, things to think of. I'm going to talk about water for a minute because water is one of the most important elements to boarding your horse. They can drink on average 5 to 10 gallons of water a day. However, this could be increased by a hotter, drier climate, or the amount of work that they're doing as well. Lack of access to clean, fresh water can be a major medical risk for most horses, but especially for horses who already have dietary restrictions or struggles. If a horse is dehydrated, they can easily lead to colic. It can lead to major dehydration, seizures, muscle spasms, a whole list of medical issues if they don't have that access to water. Automatic waterers, as shown here, are a really good option, especially if you don't always have the time or don't have the facility to easily refill buckets. The only downside is that you can't easily track your horse's water consumption. So again, as I've mentioned before, I sound like a broken record, but there are pros and cons to everything. So a lot of this is going to be your personal preference and kind of what works for you in your area. Buckets are easy to track your horse's water consumption. However, if you do live in a cold climate like we do here in Laramie, they do freeze very easily. There are heated buckets that you can get that have the heater already attached in the bottom and you just plug them in, or there are water heaters that you can just insert into the water as well. The only caveat to those is sometimes the horse doesn't like seeing that object in such a small area to drink from, so some horses might shy away from it, some horses might not care. But again, it's just another thing to think of if you do live in a cold climate like out here in Wyoming too, is making sure that you're willing and able to check for ice and break it as necessary. A few more things to think of with boarding is your hay storage. Again, these might only pertain to you if you are boarding at your own location or your own house or farm. If you're at a boarding facility, you might not have to worry about this because typically they have all that covered. But hay storage, so we like to keep them out of the elements because they do grow mold very easily if you keep them exposed. Another thing you notice is in these big hay stacks, if you see them kind of out in the sun, they do get bleached from the sun and do lose a lot of their nutritional content over time if they're left out into the sun. You want to make sure that it's kept off the direct ground just to avoid gaining any more excess moisture, which we don't want in there for a number of reasons, mold being one of them. But especially in hotter climates in the summer, hay needs to stay under a certain percentage of internal moisture to prevent spontaneous combustion. I did not know that was a thing until a few years ago. I actually heard a story about that happen in someone's barn. But 18% is about the moisture content you're looking for. Now, this is something you can ask from your hay supplier as well to see how exactly they harvest and bale their hay. Just make sure it's properly dried before they bale it, because that can be a huge fire risk in hotter climates. And with that being said as well, we try to keep our hay away from your main barn, but if your only hay storage option is in the hay loft of your barn, just make sure you don't overcrowd it. Make sure there's enough circulation. Again, just to keep it cool and dry as best as you can. Yes, questions? Voice recording.
Okay. Can you talk about the round bales versus the
Absolutely.
rectangular flake bales?
Yes.
I'm familiar with?
Absolutely. So large bales can come in either round bales, as you see here, or even large square bales down here. Those are good options for pasture boarding. So you don't have to individually toss the small bales, which actually flake into sections. This kind of helps the horses stay in their most natural eating habits. Like I mentioned before, horses typically graze and roam for about 16 hours a day. So it lets them kind of feed off the hay when they want to and then leave it when they don't want it. The round bales, it kind of just depends on your hay dealer and how you prefer them to be stored. Round bales, as you can see, they stack, but depending on your hay storage options, they might not fit as well as large square bales. But yeah, large bales are a good option if you don't want to be tossing hay every single day, if you want your horses to be able to free feed. And then the smaller bales are a good option if you want to control how much your horse eats as well.
Are these more economical, the round ones? I'm only
They-
familiar with the
Yeah,
traditional ones.
yeah. They can be, depending on where you are out west. They are pretty common for larger livestock pastures. Again, because the smaller bales typically to be a little bit more expensive, just because they're a little bit more labor intensive getting them baled and stacked. A lot of the times you see people stacking them by hand because they're smaller. These larger bales you can use with a forklift and a tractor to get those stacked as well. But yeah, small bales are a little bit more expensive. They are more convenient if you have kind of a smaller operation, in terms of if you only have stalled horses. Obviously, you can't really get a large bale into only stalled horses, so they're good options for horses who are on pasture 24/7. And depending on your location and for your purposes, yes, they can be more economical for sure. Did that answer your question? I hope. Okay, perfect. All right, I'm going to move this over to Brittany, and she's going to talk about a little bit of a budget to consider.
There you go. Thank you. So, of course, when you're looking for a horse, you should also consider if you have the money to afford the horse, as that is a good reason of why we see a lot of our surrenders are financial hardships. So, of course, preventing that, even though some financial hardships are hard to see in your future, budgeting before you purchase a horse is a big start to preventing that from occurring. So, here's some items to think of when you're creating your budget. So, of course, just like Liz spoke about earlier, hay, board are all going to, of course, be fixed expenses on your budget, meaning that they'll occur every single month, as well as grain and supplements if your horse needs grain and supplements, which when we get the horses out later today, we can discuss the ones that have grain and supplements and why they need it compared to the ones that we have out here that don't. Also, your farrier, which most horses, it's around every 8 weeks that you'll get your farrier out here, and that cost ranges based off of if the horse is just getting a barefoot trim or if it is getting a trim and shoes. And then medical care, which is hard to always plan for, but of course, planning for at least vaccinations every single year and dewormer. And then, oh my gosh, I can't see the other one. I'm so sorry, y'all. I'm colorblind, so this really doesn't go very well for me. Emergencies, tack, and these are all, the farther we go down the list, so like once we get to emergencies and tack, those are called what in accounting we would call not fixed assets. Fixed expenses, sorry, not they're not assets, they're expenses. And that just means that they don't occur on a regular occurrence. They're not planned expenses that you have every single month at a set amount. And so these are hard to plan for, but instead, this is kind of where an emergency fund or putting aside money every single month for savings comes into play, because you are not hypothetically paying for emergencies every single month. So that includes tack as well, any barn supplies. If a lead rope breaks and you want to buy a new lead rope, that might be where that plays in. A manure fork, that might be a one startup cost that you'll have when you get a horse. But of course, those break, especially in winter. Um, and so those are costs that you're still going to want to save for, even though it seems like a one time cost. That is one that in the future you might need another manure fork because they tend to break. And then a veterinary kit, that's another startup cost. Is of course that when you're getting a horse, you should at least have some items that your vet would recommend for you to have on hand at all times. And then blankets, especially with the climate here, you will need a winter blanket for protecting the horse during some storms that that will occur. Not likely, I wish. And then also a trailer, and that's another one where goes into saving, and you don't necessarily need a trailer once you purchase a horse, but it is also another good one to always think of, what do I want to have purchased already before adopting or purchasing a horse, because that might be one where you want that as actually my my first initial cost of getting a horse, or you might want it as I fell in love with this horse, but I'm going to continue to save $50 every single month to eventually purchase a trailer in the future. So yeah, and so on here it just shows a format on how you can create a monthly budget, as that is the expectation usually of budgets, is that you go every single month and just setting aside a good portion of money that you are comfortable using towards a horse every single month, and then writing out those fixed expenses. I keep wanting to say it's a balance sheet. And those fixed expenses would be that hay, the board, and farrier costs that are for sure going to be incurred every month or every other month. And then making sure that you're also putting aside money for basically your own horse emergency fund.
Can you talk a little bit about inflation and how you've seen that affect the cost of hay here?
Yes, that is a good question. And I will let Sarah jump in if I miss anything. But so a lot of it has the environmental effects as well for hay, because hay, it really does determine, it's based a lot on weather as well. And so weather can be an impact on how much moisture occurred during the year. So when could they cut the hay? Because hay has to, once it's cut, it has to stay on the ground for a few days before they can bale it, but they don't want any moisture on it, or that can make it rotting hay, which is okay for cows, and like goats, I think. But that hay is not good enough for horses. They can get really sick from that. And so that becomes an issue of how much horse hay can be produced. There's also the issue, especially this summer, with gasoline going skyrocketing high. And that caused almost everyone transports hay on a semi. And with semi costs going up, with diesel going extremely high, then that made their production costs go really high. And so we saw bales be a little more expensive this year. I would say probably in comparison, it was around $15 more expensive for a big bale. So we tend to get like 750-pound bales for our horses, which can limit waste, kind of depends. And then we'll usually use those. And then here we use smaller bales because it's better for the functioning of what we do here, and feeding twice a day is a lot easier. Yes, and we'll move on.
Yeah, so the cost of hay, I've seen it raise about 20% in the past 6 years, and that's just, COVID, inflation, gasoline, everything going up. it does fluctuate a lot during the year. So like Brittany was saying, it really depends on the moisture, but the hay can't even grow until like looking into June here because it just stays so cold so long. So first cutting is typically in July. And then the last cutting has to be before around October when we start getting the storms again. So that's going to be your cheapest time to buy hay is when they're actively cutting it. If you're looking in November, December, January to try to find hay, they're going to skyrocket their prices because, supply and demand. If their supply is low, then their demand is high and costs are high. So what we always try to do is we'll purchase hay kind of as needed throughout the summer, and then we'll make one big purchase to try to get us from November all the way through May or June, because that's kind of the most economical way to do it. But then you're risking some mold, which doesn't tend to happen until around April because it stays so cold that the mold can't grow in Laramie, Wyoming. But that is a risk.
And are you buying Wyoming or Colorado hay?
We have bought both.
So it kind of depends on your hay provider. So, for example, this year, our hay provider, he has quite a few fields for clients that he just goes and cuts their hay. And so we got hay from Walden, Colorado, and then we've gotten hay from his other fields in Wyoming before. It kind of just depends on your provider and where they cut the hay. I can't say I know much about their industry because I'm like, I don't know how the whole deal works with him and his clients. But so this is a little bit of our budget, and that's another thing to that was discussed is sometimes with hay, you can buy it on a monthly to monthly basis, or you can make sure that you kind of act like us, and in October you're making a larger purchase of hay, but then in November through April you're not purchasing any hay, so you're purchasing the same, you're spending the same amount of money that you were planning to in the entirety of the year, but you might be assuming that you'll take a large purchase at one of those months just because of the difference in cost. So yeah, and then this is just a sample budget of making sure to, those are our fixed expenses compared to making sure you're putting money aside for savings and emergencies, just like you do, just like you're supposed to do yourself of an emergency fund. A horse needs an emergency fund as well.
So it's really easy when you're beginning your journey as you're looking at horses to kind of fall in love with everything you see, and especially color and build, and to really kind of get a little attached to that. But it's also important to really make sure that the horse you're end up with is going to really work for you, and so have some realistic goals for what you're looking for. And so that's what that best fit worksheet is all about, and we're going to talk through the different categories on there if you want to fill that out as we go. So next slide, please. So the first big one is, what are your horsing goals? So if you can see your sheet, if you want to take a minute to kind of look through, what is it that you envision doing with your horse ideally? So what disciplines would you like to get into? And so while you guys are still writing, just so what that affects in terms of what you want to do is what breeds may be appropriate for, because certain breeds were bred for certain types of activity. More than that, it's even about build and conformation, which we'll talk about later in the presentation, about the amount of soundness that that horse has, whether they can handle what you're going to want to throw at them, their age, and whether they're still physically able to do that. And then also very much temperament, because there are some horses that will want to engage in the activities. So for example, if you have a very spooky horse who just is that way kind of by nature, they may not be the best trail horse to go out with. There's a certain amount that training can take care of, but if you have a very anxious horse, that may not be the place for them, but they may excel in other disciplines. So those are things as we go through the presentation to kind of bear in mind. Do your goals match up with the type of horse that you're looking for? And then another question that's on your worksheet there, if you want to go ahead and fill that one out, which is, how much time do you feel like you have to spend with your horse? How many days a week or hours a day do you really have? So if you want to kind of think about that for a moment. And then what that will affect will be, again, the type of horse that you're looking for. If you're getting a very green horse or a hot horse, they have more energy demands. You need to go out and work with them more often. just to have that time in on them, whether that's training or contact time or exercise, just to get their energy out. Whereas if you have an older horse, they might be able to sit for longer between the times when you go out. And that's, those are broad categories. They won't necessarily fall into that, but knowing the horse when you go to meet horses, having a projection of how much time you might need to have in on them and if that fits with your lifestyle, because it's not fair to the horse if they need you more than you're able to be there. And that's about temperament again. And then also some horses have greater social needs. They want the contact. So for example, I have 2 horses. We have an older Arabian mare who has basic training and does pretty well. You can leave her for a couple weeks at a time. You come back, she's the same horse. She just likes to hang out. And she's good with my daughters. And then I adopted, he's 12 now, but he has a lot of energy and he's very green. And if I don't spend at least 3 to 4 days a week with that horse, when I come back to him, it's like I have to restart every time. If I have a week or 2 off, I'm starting back, maybe not at square one, but square 1.5. So knowing how much you need to invest in that horse and making sure you're looking for horses that will fit your lifestyle, and which is about what your horse needs, right? And so making sure that you're looking for that. Next slide, even though I know it's little, it's also on the, you can leave the light on for these pretty much because it's on the worksheet as well. But so your size and your fitness are also going to affect what type of horse you should be looking for. So a horse should carry a maximum of 20% of its weight, and that includes tack and rider. So there is a spot on there to fill out your calculations sheet with your weight. And that'll give you an estimate of about the size of horse that you're looking for in terms of its weight. And then kind of a projection if you think you're going to ride English or Western. And a lot of that is also based on, and Laura, if you want to video for a second. Yeah, thank you. So weight isn't everything involved. It's also about balance. And so we have Sarah's going to do a handy demo for us on if you think of a horse. Sarah's our horse,
All right,
horse model.
I'm a horse. And this is my rider, right? I'm going to walk. I'm going to start running this rider. Right? So this is not a balanced rider. This is a rider that's like pounding on my back and needs to work on their seat a little bit. So even though this backpack is a lot heavier, it is designed to be balanced. It's not designed for me to have a jacket on. So now if I go running, this is way easier. I can do this for a lot longer, and it's a lot easier on all of my joints. So think about that while your horse is like moving and how you can help be a backpacking backpack.
So that has to do both with your own fitness level of being able to kind of keep up with your horse, but also your training and riding level. And making sure that if you're a beginner rider, that you do take those lessons because your balance is going to affect how well your horse can carry you. So that's balance, as I say, affects that. Also height. So I know I love leggy, warm blood thoroughbreds. I am not a tall person. I can ride them. However, my ideal mount is probably shorter than that because I have a shorter leg. Ideally, you want those heels to hit between the midpoint of the barrel, which is where it kind of starts to curve back down, and the bottom of the barrel. So you don't want them up here, kind of on the top part of the ribs, and you don't want them hanging off down below. So that's something to keep in mind as well as you're looking at horses, to make sure that you fit the horse, because that ensures good communication that's safe and comfortable for them. And I say that's not a totally hard and fast rule, but it is something to bear in mind, to say your communication will be better if you're more matched to the size of the horse that you're riding. And then also another one, if you plan on doing a lot of trails, for example, or if you're going to be riding in a space that doesn't have mounting block, that you're able to get on from the ground if you need to. If you're riding exclusively in an arena where that's available, then you should be fine. But again, that's height-based, height and fitness. You need to be able to kind of pull yourself up. And then fitness also, I think we think of riding, or a lot of people think of riding as it's just you sit there and the horse does all the work, but it's a very, very active sport. And so thinking about the horse that you're looking into getting in terms of what's their activity level, can you keep up with them? That's both. Do you need to catch them in the pasture? If you're doing groundwork, for example, sometimes I get really winded just lunging my horse, especially if they're a greener horse and they need a lot of encouragement. But riding is work, and so that's something to think about if you don't currently have an exercise routine. If you're thinking about getting a horse, it might be nice to start one. And that also helps with your joints and your body, and also your riding ability and the muscles that you're able to work to help make sure, again, that you have good communication with your horse. So, all right, next slide. So that brings us to experience level. So again, that's on the worksheet if you want to leave light on. Apologies. On your worksheet, there's a section there for experience level if you want to take a moment to fill that out. If you haven't yet. Then did you already fill that part out?
I'm good.
Okay, okay. So I can talk about that. So I have the riders up here, but on the worksheet is also, if you're new to owning horses, to be realistic about that, you probably don't want to bring in a brand new 2-year-old that doesn't have any handling, right? Because that might be above where you are. And that it's appropriate. It's nice to think about stepping up, but if you do that, to do that with support, that you make sure you know a trainer or somebody to give you lessons, to make sure that you're able to meet the needs of the horse and be safe is really the big thing there with the horse. So our definitions, and these will vary, and so that's something to check as you're talking with owners, what their definitions are of beginner, intermediate, or advanced rider. Actually, go ahead and turn the lid off. Thanks. So our definitions are: a beginner would be just learning how to sit, the walk, trot, and canter. An intermediate would be that they could sit, walk, trot, and canter, but might have a hard time focusing on correction and cues while they're still maintaining their seat and balance. While an advanced rider can maintain that seat and give complex cues and or corrections. So again, you might want to verify if there's an owner that's listed, this is a intermediate friendly horse. That might mean something different to them. So make sure you're on the same page. And again, that you're never done learning, right? We all, even when you get to advanced or you get to trainer, there's so much more to learn, and every horse teaches us something new. So good to have a little bit of humility there. If you are more of a beginner and you decide, I really want this horse, but it doesn't have the training yet, and you want to send them away to a trainer, just be aware that that doesn't necessarily all come back with the horse, that you need to be able to back up what the trainer did as well. And so work with the trainer perhaps on some of those, have an instructor that can really help you back that up, because just because it's gone out to a trainer doesn't mean like, whoop, it's finished, it's done. You need to be able to work with them as well, and you can get into trouble pretty quickly if you're unable to do that. And then the question, just as you're looking at horses, can you handle any potential problems that that horse might have? And so again, beautiful horse, they say it bucks occasionally. I can, that's fine. Is it really? Are you really prepared to come off and eat dirt? And you know, I mean, all horses at some point are going to act goofy, and that's something to know as well. But if some of those problems are known, make sure you're really actually trained and prepared to handle those problems. All right, if you want light one more time. So again, sorry for this on and off. On the back side of your sheet, there's just an open box called traits. And what I'd like you to kind of think of here, if we could advance the slide, please, thank you, are just kind of, what are you looking for in a horse? So what are the traits that you value? And you can think of this generally in a partner too, if you don't have horses that you already know, but spirit and energy. Do you like a companion that thinks about things? Do you want a horse that what's called in your pocket, where they're really friendly and cuddly and they like to be close to you? Not all horses like to be loved on, so is that something that would bother you? And you might think about traits as well that you really don't want. They're things that you really wouldn't deal with. So what are your ideals? These are the traits I would like to see in a horse. And many of you already did that in your ISO. Versus this something I just would draw the line at. And this is actually back on the other side of the worksheet. I'm going to talk about it for a minute, but there's a box on there about your kind of family situation, and what your household is what your household setup is. If you want to take a minute to fill that out, think about who else is in your house with you. So the question is your household ready for your horse? And also, is your horse ready for your household? So things to know, all horses need a herd companion. That doesn't necessarily need to be another horse. That's certainly maybe what's most comfortable for them, but it can be a mini horse, it could be a donkey, sometimes even goats, but they are herd animals and they will not be psychologically healthy if they don't have a herd to be with. At least one other animal that is there with them consistently. I didn't put it on here, but another thing to note would be if you are planning on, saying, taking one horse to a lesson or out to a trail, your other companion animal might need a companion as well, because that can be distressing. So just to think about herd size and where you may ultimately need to end up depending on your goals and what you said your activities would be on that front side. What is the composition of this household? So other pets, do you have dogs? Are they used to horses? Will they be able to be safe around horses? Are the horses that you're looking at when you talk to the owners, have they been around dogs? And so making sure that that relationship, if there's some training that might need to happen there on those sides to make sure they can be safe together. Other livestock. So for example, at the rescue for a little while, we were looking after a donkey. And oh my God, if half of our horses just walking by that donkey didn't freak out big time. Yeah.
Same thing happened in Florida. We got a donkey, and there were some horses that just could not
Yes.
handle it.
Yep. So.
And it was weird.
Yeah, they were just very suspicious.
Yes.
Like,
What is this thing? And also the mini horse. When the mini horse came in, we had a couple that were like, "What is that? That is not. I don't know what that is."
They're okay with the ponies, like the little Shetlands.
Yeah.
But it was the donkey set a couple up.
Mm-hmm.
And it would
Yep.
go in the wash rack.
Yep.
Would spook and
Yep.
act all like flipped out and everything.
Yep.
Yeah.
And the really big one is llamas. A lot of horses hate llamas. So just know that if you have other livestock and other pets, it may be something that's going to require training on both ends to stay safe. And that if you are getting other types of livestock as a companion, there may or may not work out depending on the horse. Again, training can usually kind of take care of that, but it may need training, so plan for that. And then also, if you have folks in your household that haven't been around horses and that don't have horse safety knowledge. So you may be the one riding or caring for the horse, but everybody in the household should know something about how to remain safe around that horse and what the safety rules are, especially small children. And again, that's something to consider as you're looking at purchasing or adopting a horse. What other animals has this horse been around? What types of people can they handle, newbies or small children that might run up to them and so on, if that's a factor in your household. So make sure that they're aware of all those things. Couple notes. So any introductions that you do, make sure those are taking place in a controlled environment, but where all parties can get away if they need to, if something funky happens. That means the horse and the people, if they can move away from each other, so that nothing is forced. And then also, if you have horses already, or if you're going to be getting multiple horses, make sure they meet over a fence before they're introduced together in the same pasture. And then when you do put them together, if they're getting along over the fence, then it needs to be a large pen for the same reason, so they can move away as they're trying to work out their herd dynamics. All right, I think, is that it for me on this one? Next slide, yeah.
All right, so now you know what you're looking for, but how do you find it? So there's a lot of different venues and areas that you can use to look for your dream horse. These include rescues, online clearinghouses or online websites, private sellers, horse traders, breeders, word of mouth, auctions, which include low-end and consignment sales, and kill pens. All of these are not actually recommended, and we'll go over why. So, rescues, they typically intake their horses from a variety of different situations, and these situations include owner surrenders. So that's just, hey, I have this horse, I can't keep it. Maybe the training is too much for me. I have unexpected medical bills, Or, as we've been getting more and more often, is maybe I can't sell it, or I don't want to sell it on the private market. This horse is 10 years old and is barely halter broke. If I put it on Facebook, who knows who's going to pick it up? I don't want it to go to a kill buyer. Will a rescue take it? So we do get a lot of those. It could be, we've had breeders that are like a similar situation, run into medical problems, and they're like, I have these older, not very well trained horses that I just don't want them to end up in a bad place. Will you take them? So rescues get a lot of horses like that. Law enforcement seizures, typically these horses come in a bad state. Law enforcement typically does not seize horses that aren't at risk of some serious health issues. So these horses typically go through a lot of rehab and may have some existing trauma that you'll have to manage. Livestock auctions, these horses, a lot of rescues will go down and bid against kill buyers at livestock auctions, and these horses kind of have a completely unknown history, similar with kill pens. So rescues are not all created equally, and they vary in how they approach their rehabilitation, training, and adoption process. They don't usually know a complete history of their horses, and so you just kind of have to work with the rescue on what they do know and take an experienced friend that you can kind of brainstorm with and try to evaluate if the horse is right for you. So how do you choose a rescue? Because as we've all probably read on the news, not all rescues are created equally. So one way that you can kind of judge the validity of a rescue is if they have a 501c3 status, and this means that they are registered public charity. They have to meet certain requirements with the federal government in terms of how they use their money, how they intake their money, that kind of stuff. This also means that you can look at their financials on an IRS website. Any 501c3, actually I think any nonprofit, you can go onto an IRS page and make sure you understand and you agree with how that rescue is using their funds. Make sure you support who you're giving your money to and who you're adopting from. What does their adoption process entail? A lot of rescues do not actually give ownership over to the new owner. They kind of hang on to that brand inspection. So, if you're okay with that, if you're not okay with that, that's something for you to decide. They also have different adoption processes, including, how they inspect your barns, how they inspect you, how they decide that you are the right person for that horse, and also how their checkups go. So a lot of rescues want not a lot. Some rescues will want a monthly or a yearly checkup picture. Show me that your horse is still looking good. So it's important when you find a rescue just to ask, what does your adoption process entail? Will I get the ownership of the horse? That kind of stuff. And then finally, how do the horses look? If they've had a horse for a few months, a few years, and their feet are overgrown, they're skinny, they don't look healthy, that's definitely maybe a concern.
All right, so another place that you can look are these big online clearinghouse websites. So these are usually national websites where individuals will post, sometimes organizations like rescues. We have ours on a couple of these. A couple examples, and there's a lot out there that you can search, but equine.com, we have some there. ASPCA Right Horse is for rescues to post their horses. Dreamhorse.com and Ranch World. So next slide, we'll take a look. So this is equine.com. One of the nice things about this is you can use filters to kind of narrow your search. You are, of course, limited to whoever it is that happens to be posting, and that's why sometimes you may have to look at several of these. It's not going to be comprehensive for all the horses available out there. As an example, I just chose for state, Nebraska. Let's see if we can find any quarter horses. This is breed. And what do you want to do with that horse? I chose trail horse. So next slide. So in this case, it only brought up one result for quarter horse trail horses in Nebraska. And that was this one here. So we can kind of take a look at what is the deal with this horse. I'm going to bring that up. So this would be a typical kind of listing, definitely photos, hopefully photos from different angles. Often there's an option for videos as well. You can kind of see if they've had some riding training. Clearly they're trying to prove here that their horse is very nicely handled. It'll have name, price, location, breed, gender, height, color, foal date, weight, and disciplines. They only listed one here, temperament as well, and we'll talk about later what these numbers mean. They listed it as a temperament 3. And then next slide, so this is half of it. If you scroll down, you get the full description. It's a little tough to read on here, but it says, I think it says mare. I'm not sure actually what that says, or mark. Is quarter horse type, mare. I think she is not papered, meaning they don't know her bloodlines. We were we were told she was purchased at an Amish sale. So we were told, that might raise a little flag, like we don't have all the information here. 13-year-old boy rode her for 4-H and Gincana, bought her 2 years ago for our daughter who's autism spectrum. She took lessons on her. We also sent Linda, I guess is the horse's name, to a feedlot for 3 months to add to her training. So she's had a lot of different types of experience, knows how to neck rein, but she will test her rider. So not recommended for a beginner. And so the question is, what are they kind of defining here? But the testing gives you a clue of if you want to put up with that, a horse that might test you. Our daughter took some lessons on her and did well. Linda was also ridden out on a ranch for 30 days where she was used to rope cattle. She had a bay roan colt the year before we bought her. Her exact birth date is not known. So their date that they had up there was an estimate. They don't actually know. We are not sure how much she weighs. Her height and age are approximate. So all of those details, while they were listed, you want to make sure you read these listings carefully to get the full picture. And then they tell you where else she's listed, and they do have a video up on YouTube, which it's good to get all the information that you possibly can before you would contact an owner. And then on this, you can ask more questions. But just to give you an idea of the type of things you might see on listing, and then you can decide if you'd want to pursue that and contact this person if that's within the scope of what you're looking for. All right, next slide. Here's another one, ASPCA right horse. So this is for, say, rescues to list the horses they have. Not all rescues qualify to be listed there. You do have to be at a certain level of partnerships and kind of accepted by right horse in order to be able to do so. So you do have to be vetted, essentially, to be on this site. So they make it nice and easy. Find my right horse. Be on the next slide. So here, this is just sort of a listings that they're highlighting. If we go to more filters, you can set filters on this site as well. And there's a little more robust. So you can search for a particular organization if there's some that you know that you like. Keywords, breeds. I selected a bunch here. I was looking for if I were to get my 10-year-old daughter her own horse. So some things I know she likes. She likes paints. So paint, pinto, difference between the breed and the color. She could go pony. We could go grade. It's fine. We already have a 20-year-old beginner horse, so I don't necessarily need an older one. So I set this a little back, 8 to 17. Location, this is where we are. I can do distance. How far do I really want to drive from here? Wyatt thinks we're in Jelm. I don't know. I was like, let's go mares. Mares are the best. Okay. Height range, and then capped out budget-wise at $2,500. So let's see, what do we get when we do that? All right, so here are a couple. These are actually ours here, which is interesting. Canary and Fanic. I don't think I'd actually recommend either for my daughter, but we didn't maybe set quite enough filters. This is pretty cute down here, so we're gonna go with this little paint pony and see what the deal is with this. All right, so they give you a nice overboat. So I was looking at the steamboat. Overview of steamboat. $1,000, that's a nice price. They give you a weight limit, so they do that calculation for you, which is nice. Diet just on grass, no special needs at this time. Training level 1, I'm not sure what that means for them, but they're going to tell you a little more here. been started under saddle in our training program, working on building confidence on the ground and around people. Best with someone that has colt starting experience. That's not my daughter. My 10-year-old's not. It might be fun for me. Probably not for my 10-year-old. So it's nice to read through these descriptions and say you get these pretty pictures and we get all excited, but you have to do the reality check. Does that fit with what I say I actually need? Next slide, please. And then there's more information about if that did appeal to me. And I thought you have height, you have age, and so on. So that's the HH means hands high. We'll talk a little later about what that means if you're not familiar with that. And then here's the agency, and you could go into further inquiries if you wanted. Next slide, please. All right, so that's kind of those big national websites. I think a lot of where horse looking is happening these days and selling is on Facebook. And there are lots of groups specifically for equine activities in most areas where people live. And so that would be one thing to just start searching on your Facebook, what equine groups are there. Facebook does not legally allow selling animals. So be careful with your posts and communications and how you're handling them, because it can shut these groups down. But it's the reality of kind of how we have for looking for horses these days. So the information about horses, and we'll look at this in a second, is often buried in the comments. There'll be a pretty picture and they'll just say rehome, and then you have to go find what is the actual deal. So it takes a lot of combing through, or you might need to message that seller directly to ask those questions. Also, so some of the folks there will be private owners and some will be resellers who buy and sometimes do some retraining and then kind of turn the horses around. If they've listed a website, or you can find a website, if it's a reseller, then you really want to check those carefully, as well as the reviews on who those folks are and whether they're doing a nice job handling their horses. All right, next slide. So this, for example, is mine. So just to give you an idea in this area of some of the groups that are possible, there's Colorado Horse Adoptions, Colorado Auction Horses. These are ours. These are actually our horses that are already adopted out. Everything Equine, New Wyoming Horse Network, Laramie Horses, Tack and Events and Services. So if you're here, highly recommend that one because it's nice. You can, a lot of events and networking that you can do there. Horses in Need of Homes, and so on. So let's go to this one. Next slide. Excuse me. So this is New Wyoming Horse Network. If you want to do next slide. So here's a listing that was made. And so this one, just rehome. On this site, you can actually put the full description. So started appendix filly, pleasure to be around, rides, smart and gentle, has had exposure to cows, riding out and alone, opening gates, dragging log, wants to please, athletic, good mind, can go any direction. This sure sounds like a unicorn. Lions go back to Dash to Fame, Driftwood. I don't know all my bloodlines, so that's going to mean something to someone. I started her this winter, so that's pretty recent, right? And have been very impressed with this horse. I'm only getting rid of her because the amount of riding will be due this summer. 14 hands high, so kind of on the little side. Coming 3 in April and still has some growing to do. So despite her credentials, I'm going to check carefully about this horse was just started this winter and is just 3 and has done all of that stuff. That's a lot for a young horse to do, and it's nice that they have that experience. But are you ready to work with a 3-year-old who still has a lot of energy and testing left to do and growing that she should do before she's doing a lot that's going to be difficult? Lander, so do you want to drive to Lander? And then mid, and then often people will indicate prices by doing kind of sneaky stuff like this so that there's no actual price on Facebook. And so the question is, what does mid mean to this person? Does that mean 3 or 4, or does that mean 5 to 7? So this is one where you probably have to contact the owner. All right, next slide. So here's another group, Everything Equine professional version. This is actually, it's Wyoming and Colorado. They just had to rename because they got in trouble from ways that posters were putting their posts up. So again, rehome, this is all you get. You get one kind of blurry, funky photo and rehome. But if you just love grays, you might want to scroll down and see what you can find. In this case, there are papers. Generally, that's going to tell me price is going to be higher. If they are registered, have papers and bloodlines and things. Not always, but it's something to be aware of how far down the process you want to go depending on your budget. In this case, 11-year-old Arabian gelding can go any direction you choose, selling as green broke. This term means a lot of different things to a lot of people. That can mean anything from we threw a saddle on him once. Maybe nobody got on him, but hey, a saddle on. Or had a saddle on, rode him around the round pen a couple times. He's green broke, right? Or our definition at the rescue of green, which is sometimes that they've had months on, but months is still not enough and they're still learning and testing. So you want to find out what that means to this person. In your pocket horse genuinely enjoys people, very soft in the halter and snaffle bit, giving easily to pressure, saddles well, so sounds like has had some experience. Curious, loads easily, that's always a nice thing. You always want to inquire about how well they get into a trailer. Stands for trimming, so good with the farrier, has never worn shoes. Requires intermediate advanced rider, again, so you want to find out what that is about. Plenty of energy and needs additional finishing. Well suited for a variety of disciplines. Why they're selling, has been extensively desensitized, so exposed to a lot of stuff. That's nice. Goofy and engaging fellow, fun to be around, loves company. Current, this is nice. And always, if it's not listed, you always want to ask Coggins, brand inspection, registration papers, PPE, pre-purchase exam. So that's something that's really good to do. And if you have an owner that's not willing to let you do it, that might be a red flag. But the ability to take a horse to a vet or have a vet come out and look over the horse to double check that everything's okay before you purchase. And that would usually be, yeah, at your expense, but can really save you expenses down the line or trouble that you weren't aware of. Again, they get a little sneaky with their price. So I'm going to $4,500. Asking price is very negotiable. Trade's considered. So again, this was buried way down in the comments. So I forget how many comments were on this post, but sometimes it's often going to be the first comment that was posted. So you sometimes have to go for that. And if it's not there, then often you have to just message the seller. All right, next slide.
So livestock auctions. I have a livestock auction close to here in Fort Collins, Colorado, but kind of scattered all over. It's typically like they sound. They sell all kinds of animals: cows, sheep, goats, llamas, water buffalo, all things that we've seen at livestock auctions. The horses that are left here people aren't there for a horse sale. So the horses that go through here are typically sent in loose, which means they're sent in with little to no information. There's no selling them. They're just run through the auction ring. What you see is what you see, and that's what you get. Sometimes they'll leave a little bit of information, including age, training, breed. Many of these claims are made in an effort to fetch a higher bidding price by people. So there's a lot of times this horse is totally 10 years old, and then you get it home and you look at his teeth and it's 25. We ended up bidding on an emaciated 25-year-old quarter horse, brought her home, read her lip tattoo, and she was actually a 27-year-old thoroughbred. So, you know, don't believe what they say unless you see firsthand the aspects of this horse. And unfortunately, horses are typically here for a reason, whether it's soundness issues, behavioral issues, lack of training. Every now and then, somebody's just like, I had to get rid of my horse this weekend, and they'll bring it through. But unless you're willing to take that risk of this horse having a soundness issue that it's covering up, behavioral issues that you may or may not be able to work through, or training that you may or may not have the experience to do, it's probably not worth the risk to look at a livestock auction. Consignment sales are also auctions, but they're a little bit higher end. These are typically horse exclusive. So you go there for a horse sale. Everyone is there to look at horses. Horses are usually ridden in or led in, so they're obviously handled by people. You know, you can see how they interact with people. Some auctions do provide a soundness guarantee where they're like, if you bring this horse home and you see that it's lame in 48 hours, you know, you can bring it back. We'll give you your money back. So these horses typically have better bloodlines and training. They sell for a lot more money. And, you know, you can really see they typically have like a warm-up arena where you can watch these horses move out, watch how their trainers work with them. And some auctions you can even go in and handle the horse at this time before the bidding starts. But remember that these horses, when you're sending a horse in to be ridden in through this auction, you're trying to make money off of this horse. So the person that is riding that horse is probably going to be really experienced, which means they're going to make the horse look good. And it's good to remember that just because they can make the horse look good does not necessarily mean it'll still be a good fit for you. And then, so kill pens have blown up in the past 10 years on social medias, websites. You'll see a lot of rescues that are rescuing horses from kill pens. You'll see a lot of people that are like, this is my kill pen horse. Unfortunately, today's kill buyer industry is mostly a scam. So most kill buyers will go to these livestock auctions and they'll bid against those low, those cheap horses that sell for $400 to $700, and they'll even bid against private homes, rescues, whatever. They'll take those horses, they put them on an overcrowded lot where they receive no farrier attention, no medical attention if they need it, and they post them online saying, this horse has until Sunday for someone to bail it for $1,200, $1,000, or I ship it to Mexico for slaughter. So it's kind of turned into these people are just holding these horses for ransom. And, that's going to tug at anybody's heartstrings. Nobody wants to watch a horse go to slaughter, so people pay them. And then they take that $1,000 and they go get 2 more. And then, in the meantime, there's horses getting exposed to diseases and dying on their lot where they're getting paid and they're just profiting off the backs of them. Additionally, they will also say things that may or may not be true. This horse is broke. This horse is young. This horse is healthy. That's a big one. And, there's no way you can really back it up because when you go there, it's give me the money, back up your trailer, I'll load up the horse. If you do get a horse from kill pens or really any auctions, it is recommended to quarantine the horse. One of the biggest diseases that are in these areas on these lots and in the auction houses is called strangles. And that takes 2 weeks it can take 2 weeks of an incubation period to start showing symptoms. So it's important to keep the horse away. We recommend, 3 weeks to 4 weeks, just to make sure the horse doesn't show any symptoms of any contagious diseases before letting them interact with other horses.